"If you pull that trigger," the man said, his voice steady as stone, "you'll have to kill me first, because I'm not moving." The gun was pressed directly against his chest. 40 men stood frozen behind him. His bride screamed his name, and a small-town deputy realized, too late, that he had just made the worst mistake of his life. What happened next in that California desert didn't just save a wedding. It exposed a truth that brought an entire town to its knees. If this story moves you, subscribe and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this reaches. The morning of the wedding, Cameron Whitmore woke up before the sun, not because he was nervous, not because he was afraid. He woke up early because he always woke up early. 30 years of discipline had burned that habit into his bones so deep that no amount of happiness could dissolve it. He lay still for a moment in the quiet of the rented motel room, staring at the ceiling, listening to the desert breathe outside the thin walls. Somewhere in the next room, he could hear his brothers moving. Boots on tile, the low murmur of men who'd learned to speak softly in the hours before dawn. He didn't call himself Cameron much anymore. Most people who loved him called him Deacon. Most people who feared him didn't call him anything at all. They just stepped aside when they saw the cut coming. But today, for one day, he was going to be Cameron again. Because today, he was getting married. He sat up slowly, ran both hands over his face, and looked at the suit hanging on the back of the door, not a tuxedo. Deacon Whitmore wasn't the type of man who wore a tuxedo. But Madison had picked out something for him. Dark pants, a white shirt, and he has Hell's Angels cut cleaned and pressed so carefully that it looked almost ceremonial. She told him the night before, her voice soft and laughing at the same time, "You're not going to a board meeting, Deacon. You're going to our wedding. Wear what makes you you." He smiled thinking about it. That was Madison. That had always been Madison. He reached down and scratched behind Ranger's ears. The old shepherd was awake too, watching him with those steady, patient eyes. One ear up, one ear slightly bent, the way it always was since a truck had clipped him on a highway in Nevada 6 years ago. 3 legs now, moving slower than he used to, but still watching, still faithful. "Big day, boy," Deacon said quietly. Ranger thumped his tail once against the floor. Outside, the desert property looked the way it always looked at dawn, vast and open and honest. There were no trees to hide behind out here. No buildings crowding the sky. Just land and light in the kind of silence that made a man hear his own thoughts, whether he wanted to or not. The club had arrived 2 days early to build everything themselves. That was important to understand. These weren't men who hired things done. Every chair, every wooden arch, every string of simple white lights, all of it had been built and hung and arranged by hands that could just as easily have fixed an engine block or welded a steel frame. Former soldiers, mechanics, carpenters who never called themselves carpenters, men who understood that when something mattered, you didn't outsource it. You showed up, you worked, you made it with your own hands, so it meant something when it was done. Big Red, a 6'4" former Army sergeant with a voice like gravel and a laugh that carried half a mile, had built the altar himself from 2x4s he'd driven 4 hours to pick up personally. He'd sanded it 3 times. 3 times, because the first 2 weren't smooth enough, and he refused to let Madison catch a splinter on her wedding day. "She gets 1 wedding," he told Deacon the night before, setting down his beer. "And it's gonna be right." Deacon had nodded. That was the thing that strangers never understood about these men. The thing that the news never showed. Behind every patch, behind every piece of leather, behind every tattoo that made comfortable people uncomfortable, there was a man who had decided that loyalty meant something, that showing up meant something, that the people you called your brothers were worth every sacrifice you could give. These men had given a lot. Most of them had given things they never talked about. By 9 in the morning, the property was full. 43 members had made the drive. Some had come from as far north as Oregon, some from Nevada. A few old-timers had ridden in from Arizona. Their bikes weathered and loud and beautiful in the way that only old machines can be. Brothers who hadn't seen each other in months shook hands and embraced in that particular way that men who've survived things together always do. Quick and firm, but with weight behind it. The property owner, a retired rancher named Gerald Putt, had given them full permission. He'd known Deacon for 11 years. He'd signed the paperwork without hesitation and told him, "You take as long as you need. My land is your land today." Deacon had the paperwork in his jacket pocket. He'd folded it carefully and put it there himself that morning, the way a man carries something he knows he might need later. He didn't know why, but something in him, that old instinct, the one that had kept him alive in places he'd never described to civilians, told him to keep it close. That instinct had never been wrong. Madison Cole arrived at 10:15. She stepped out of the car that her sister had driven, and when Deacon saw her from across the property, he forgot everything he'd ever known about how to act like a man who didn't feel things. She was wearing a simple white dress, no cathedral train, no veil that cost more than a motorcycle. Just a dress that fit her exactly right, with her hair the way he loved it. Loose, a little wild, the way it always looked when she'd been laughing. She was laughing now. She saw him and laughed and pressed one hand over her mouth and shook her head like she couldn't believe this was finally happening. 11 years. They'd been together 11 years. Anyone who knew them said it was inevitable. That from the first night they'd met, at a diner in Bakersfield, where Madison had been the waitress who told him straight to his face that she wasn't going to pretend to be intimidated just because he looked scary, it was inevitable. "You're not scary," she'd told him that first night, setting down his coffee without spilling a drop. "You're just big." He'd come back the next night, and the night after that. Now here she was, walking toward the altar his brothers had built, walking toward him, and for a moment, just a moment, the whole world was exactly what it was supposed to be. The ceremony was supposed to start at 11. It started at 11. Preacher Walsh, an older man who'd ridden with the club 20 years ago before finding God and becoming actually ordained, stood behind the altar and looked out at the assembled brothers with the particular combination of peace and authority that only men of certain age can manage. He'd performed 3 weddings in his life. He'd told Deacon the night before that this one was the one he'd been waiting for. "You don't find a woman like Madison twice," he'd said, "so the first time better count." "It's going to count," Deacon had told him. Ranger sat at Deacon's side. Someone had tied a small white ribbon around his neck, which he tolerated with the dignity of a dog who understands that some things must be endured. Preacher Walsh opened his book and looked at Deacon. He looked at Madison. He took a breath, and then he heard the sound of tires on gravel. Everyone heard it, that particular crunch, slow, deliberate, official, that carries a different weight than ordinary traffic. 2 vehicles, moving carefully, stopping just beyond the property line where the gravel met the road. The road. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. But every man there felt it, that old warning signal firing somewhere behind the sternum. That animal instinct that said, something just changed. Deacon turned. 2 sheriff's department vehicles sat parked on the edge of the road. 2 deputies stepped out. One was tall, mid-40s, with the walk of a man who had decided before he even arrived that he already knew everything he needed to know. The other was younger, late 20s maybe, hanging slightly back, his expression unreadable, his hands uncertain at his sides. The older deputy, his name tag read Lawson, surveyed the property with the kind of slow, deliberate contempt that doesn't have to announce itself because it's written in every line of the body. His eyes moved across the chairs, across the altar, across the 43 men in leather cuts standing in the California sun, and landed on Deacon. He started walking toward him. Not because anyone had called, not because there was a complaint, not because anything had happened, because he had seen a gathering of Hell's Angels from the road, and he had decided, in the way that certain men decide things, immediately and completely, without the interference of information, that this was a problem that required his authority. "All right," Lawson said, stopping 10 feet from Deacon. "What's going on here?" His voice had that particular flatness to it, not a question, a command wrapped in the shape of a question. Deacon looked at him for a moment, not sizing him up, not deciding anything, just looking, the way a man looks at something he's been patient with before and is prepared to be patient with again. "We're having a wedding," Deacon said. Lawson looked past him, at the altar, at the chairs, at Madison standing in her white dress with her hand in her sister's. "Uh-huh," Lawson said. "And you have permission to be on this property?" "We do," Deacon said. He reached into his jacket and produced the folded paperwork. slowly, carefully, the way a man moves when he's demonstrating that there's nothing to be afraid of. Gerald Pewitt is the owner. Here's the written authorization. Lawson looked at the paperwork. He didn't take it. Mr. Pewitt know who he was giving permission to? He knows me personally, Deacon said. 11 years. Lawson nodded slowly, the way men nod when they've already made up their minds and are just performing the ritual of appearing to consider information. He looked around at the assembled club members. Some of the younger men were watching Lawson with expressions that contained very controlled amounts of very dangerous things. The older men, the veterans, the ones who'd been in real situations, kept their faces neutral, waiting for Deacon. Here's the problem, Lawson said, his voice dropping half a register to achieve the effect of authority. I've got a gathering of known associates of a criminal organization on a residential property adjacent to a public road. That's a public safety concern. You understand what I'm saying? I understand what you're saying, Deacon said, and I'm telling you it's not accurate. We have authorization. We have no criminal activity occurring. We have a wedding ceremony that was in progress before you arrived, and I'd like to finish it. Something happened in Lawson's face. Just a flicker. Something that wasn't quite anger yet, but was moving in that direction. That particular irritation that certain men feel when the person in front of them refuses to behave in the way they've already decided that person should behave. Step over here with me, Lawson said. Sir, the younger deputy said from behind him. Quiet, barely audible. Sir, maybe we should... Evan! Lawson said the name like a door being closed. The younger man stopped talking. Deacon stepped forward, not submissively, not aggressively, just forward, meeting the situation the way he always met situations, by walking directly into them. What I'd like to know, Lawson said quieter now, and somehow more dangerous for it, is why 40 Hells Angels are assembled in the middle of the desert on a Wednesday morning. I told you, Deacon said. Wedding. Your wedding. My wedding. To her. Lawson glanced toward Madison without actually looking at her, the way certain men dismiss things they don't want to acknowledge. To her, Deacon confirmed. She know who she's marrying? The desert went absolutely still. It was the kind of silence that happens when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Not loud, not violent, just final. A line drawn in the sand with a single question. Behind Deacon, he felt the shift before he heard anything. The collective intake. The hands that moved imperceptibly differently. 43 men who knew how to read a room, and every single one of them had just read this one the same way. Big Red made a sound in the back of his throat that wasn't a word, but communicated something that words would have been inadequate to contain. Deacon said nothing for 3 full seconds. Then, she knows exactly who she's marrying. His voice hadn't changed. Not a single degree warmer, not a single degree colder. Just the same. Steady. The voice of a man who had decided a long time ago that he would not become the thing that people with limited imaginations expected him to become. Lawson smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. Here's what's going to happen, he said. You're going to wrap this up. You're going to clear the property. And you're going to move along before this becomes something official. That was the first moment. The moment when the whole thing balanced on the edge of a blade. Because Deacon Whitmore had been in that position before. Not with a wedding at stake. Not with Madison in a white dress 20 yards behind him. But in that position, that specific position where the person in front of you is wrong, is being cruel, is exercising power in the worst possible way, and is counting on the fact that you'll confirm every ugly story they've ever told about you by responding with exactly the violence they're expecting. He'd been there before. He knew what happened when men like him gave men like Lawson exactly what Lawson was looking for. He knew what it cost. So he breathed, slowly, let the breath out through his nose, and looked at Deputy Lawson with eyes that had seen considerably more than the deputy had likely encountered in his entire career, and said, Deputy, I'm asking you to reconsider. This is a private event on private property with proper authorization. Nobody here is breaking any law. I'm asking you to let us finish what we started. I already told you what's happening. Then I'm asking you again. Something about the repetition, the absolute refusal to escalate, the calm asking twice in the face of contempt, seemed to aggravate Lawson more than any threat would have. He took a step forward. You deaf, or are you just stupid? The younger deputy, Evan Brooks, said, Sir, then I swear to God, I just think maybe we should stand down. Lawson stepped past Deacon. He walked to the nearest row of chairs, the ones Big Red had spent 2 days building and arranging. He grabbed the back of the first one, a chair that Red had sanded 3 times so Madison wouldn't catch a splinter, and shoved it sideways. It hit the chair next to it. That one fell. Nobody breathed. Lawson kept walking. He went to the table where the small meal was laid out. Food that members' wives and girlfriends had spent the previous day cooking. He put his hand on the edge of it. Hey, Madison's voice. Clear, controlled, but with something in it that was absolutely not controlled. Hey, that is our food. You do not touch that. Lawson looked at her for the first time. Ma'am, you need to step back. I am the bride, Madison said. Her voice had moved into that particular register that certain women find when they are beyond ordinary anger and have arrived somewhere entirely more dangerous. This is my wedding, and you have no right. Ma'am, step back. Madison, Deacon's voice, quiet, steady, not asking her to be silent, asking her to trust him. Madison, she looked at him. Something passed between them in that look that couldn't have been spoken. She pressed her lips together. She stayed where she was, but she stopped. Evan Brooks had moved to Deacon's side almost without meaning to. He wasn't sure when he'd done it. One moment he'd been standing behind Lawson where he was supposed to be, and the next he was standing beside the biker in the desert, watching his partner walk through a wedding like he owned it, and feeling something in his chest that he couldn't quite identify but that bore a strong resemblance to shame. He looked at Deacon. Deacon was watching Lawson. His face gave nothing away, but his hands were open at his sides, palms slightly forward, fingers loose. Not a fighting stance, the exact opposite of a fighting stance. A man demonstrating, in every physical way available to him, that he was choosing not to be what the situation was trying to make him. I need to ask you something, Evan said quietly, barely above a whisper. Deacon didn't look at him, still watching Lawson. Go ahead. How are you doing this? A pause, doing what? Standing here like this while Evan stopped, because there was no word that adequately described what Lawson was doing. Deacon was quiet for a moment, then, because if I don't, the story people tell later isn't about what he did. It's about what I did. Evan thought about that. He thought about it for a long time. Lawson came back from his tour of the wedding area. His face had changed. That particular shift that happens when a man who expected resistance has not received it and doesn't know what to do with that. He looked at Deacon. He looked at the assembled club members, 43 men who had not moved, had not spoken, had not given him a single thing to work with. Something flickered behind his eyes. Not doubt, not yet, but something adjacent to it. Last time he said, pack it up, move along. Deacon looked at him. Then he did something nobody expected. He looked at Evan Brooks, not at Lawson, at the young deputy. He turned to face him, giving Lawson his back, which was itself a kind of statement, and looked at Evan Brooks with the full attention of a man who had spent decades reading people. Your father, Deacon said, his voice quiet enough that only the two of them could hear, still owns Brooks Hardware on Main Street? Evan's face changed. Does he? Yes, Evan said slowly. Yes, he does, but how did you? I grew up near here, Deacon said, long time ago, before a lot of things. He paused. Before I was what I am now. Evan stared at him. Call your sheriff, Deacon said. Before this goes any further, call him and tell him my name. Your name, Cameron Whitmore. The younger deputy's expression became complicated in ways that faces aren't usually asked to be. Uncertain, troubled, like a man standing on something he expected to be solid that has started to feel less solid than he'd like. Why, Evan said. Why would the sheriff? Call him, Deacon said simply. That's all I'm asking. Before anyone makes a decision they can't take back, call him. Lawson had heard enough of this. He stepped between them, shouldering past Deacon with the force of a man who has stopped pretending at procedural formality. He got close, too close, the way certain men get close when they have run out of other tools, and dropped his voice to something that was meant to be threatening. You think you're special, he said. You think I don't know what you are? Deacon met his eyes. Tell me what I am, son. You're a criminal wearing a costume, Lawson said, and you're standing on the wrong side of my patience. Deputy, Deacon's voice didn't waver. With respect, I am a man who served this country. I am a man who has built a community. I am a man trying to marry the woman he loves on a piece of property he has legal authorization to use. That is what I am, and I'd like you to think very carefully before you decide what happens next. Lawson stared at him. Something was happening behind his eyes. Some internal argument, some calculation, some part of him that was still, however, buried, a person with judgment rather than just a weapon with a badge. But it lost. Whatever part of him might have stepped back, it lost. He turned. He walked toward his patrol vehicle. And Evan Brooks watched him go with a feeling in his stomach that he'd had once before, on a call 3 years ago, walking toward a house where he already knew what he was going to find. That particular dread, that knowledge that what's about to happen cannot be stopped. Sir, he said, starting after Lawson. Sir, wait, I really think we should. He stopped, because Lawson had reached into the vehicle, and it wasn't for his radio. The wedding went silent. 43 men who had survived wars, who had buried brothers, who had ridden through every kind of darkness the road could offer. All of them saw it at the same time. All of them understood it at the same time. And all of them looked at the same person. Deacon. Madison said his name. Just that. One word. Not a scream yet. Not yet. But the beginning of one. The shape of one. Deacon. He heard her. He heard everything. He heard the sound of Big Red's breath changing behind him. He heard the desert wind, which had been blowing gently all morning and was now absurdly, peacefully, still blowing gently. He heard Ranger make a small sound. He heard Evan Brooks say something that wasn't quite a word. He heard all of it, and then he started walking toward the gun. Not running, walking, step by step, the way he had walked toward every dangerous thing in his life. Not because he didn't understand the danger, but because he understood it better than anyone else present and knew that the only way through it was through it. Lawson raised the weapon. Don't, he said. Don't you take another step. Deacon took another step. I am telling you to stop. Another step. I will. Deacon stopped when the weapon was close enough to touch. He stood there in his white shirt and his cut, with Ranger's white ribbon still somewhere behind him and Madison's voice somewhere behind that. And he looked at Richard Lawson, really looked at him the way almost nobody had looked at Richard Lawson in a very long time. And he said, if you think this ends with you hurting my brothers, you'll have to go through me first. His voice was absolutely calm, not because he wasn't afraid, but because there is a thing beyond fear that certain people find when the stakes are high enough and the decision is clear enough and they have already made their peace with whatever comes next. Lawson's gun hand trembled. Just slightly. Just enough. You're crazy, Lawson said, and for the first time his voice had something in it that wasn't authority, something smaller, something that might, under different circumstances, have been called fear. Maybe, Deacon said, but I'm standing here, and you have to make a decision. Evan Brooks was already at the radio. His hands were shaking. He would remember that later. The shaking. He'd held it together through the whole thing, through all of it, until the moment he reached for that radio, and then his hands would not stop trembling, and he didn't even try to make them stop, because some things deserve to be trembled at. Sheriff Hayes, he said, this is Brooks. I need you on the line, sir. We have a situation. What situation, Brooks? The sheriff's voice was steady, unhurried. The voice of a man who had been receiving radio calls for 30 years and had learned to pace his alarm. Evan looked at Deacon, standing still as stone with a weapon at his chest. The man involved, sir, he asked me to tell you his name. Evan swallowed. Cameron Whitmore. The radio went silent, not for a second, not for 2 seconds. For 4 full seconds, the radio was completely silent. And then the sheriff's voice came back, and it sounded like a man who had just heard something that he'd given up on hearing, something he thought he'd never hear again. Cameron Whitmore? Yes, sir. Another pause. And then quiet, certain, carrying the weight of 30 years. Don't let anyone touch that man. Do you hear me, Brooks? Do not let anyone touch him. I'm on my way. Lawson heard it, standing in the desert sun with his weapon raised and 43 pairs of eyes on him, and the radio in his partner's hand, saying those words in that voice. He heard every word of it, and the gun came down, not dramatically, not with some Hollywood motion. It just lowered, degree by degree, until it was at his side, until it was no longer between him and the man in the white shirt who hadn't moved. Deacon reached out slowly, carefully, with both hands visible and both movements telegraphed so that there was no ambiguity in anything he did. He took the weapon from Lawson's hand, and Lawson let him. He unloaded it the way a man who knows firearms unloads them, efficiently and without ceremony. He held out the unloaded weapon. Lawson took it back. Neither man spoke. For a long moment, neither man moved. Then Deacon said, quietly, without triumph, without malice, the way you say something that you want to actually reach the person you're saying it to, rather than just land somewhere in the vicinity of their ears. Today could have been a lot worse. Be thankful it wasn't. And he turned away. He turned back toward his wedding, toward the altar Big Red had built, toward the woman in the white dress, toward Ranger, who was sitting exactly where he'd left him, watching everything with that one slightly bent ear, thumping his tail once on the ground as Deacon came back. Behind him, Evan Brooks was staring at Richard Lawson. Lawson was staring at his own hands. He wasn't the kind of man who inspected his hands. He wasn't the kind of man who stood in desert sun looking at himself. But he was doing it now, looking at his hands the way you look at something that has just done something you didn't fully authorize and didn't fully understand, and are now, in the quiet aftermath, starting to comprehend. Sir, Evan said softly, I think we should stay back. Lawson didn't answer, but he didn't move forward either. In the distance from the road that led out of town, the sound of another vehicle was already growing. The sheriff was coming, and somewhere in the desert, with the sun now directly overhead and the wind gentle and the white ribbon still tied around an old dog's neck, a wedding that had been paused for the worst possible reason was waiting, quietly, stubbornly, with the particular patience of people who have learned that the right things take longer than they should, but are worth every moment of the waiting, to begin again. The sound of Sheriff Hayes's vehicle on the gravel road changed everything. Not immediately, not in one clean moment. It changed the way pressure changes before a storm, gradually then all at once, something shifting in the air that every person present felt in their chest before they could name it. Evan Brooks heard it first. He was still standing where he'd been when he made the radio call, his hands finally steady again, watching Lawson with the particular wariness of a younger man who has just watched someone he's supposed to trust do something he cannot explain and cannot excuse. He heard the engine. He heard the tires. And he exhaled a breath he hadn't known he was holding. Lawson heard it too. Something moved across his face. Not fear exactly, but its first cousin. The expression of a man who has acted on certainty and is now, for the first time, uncertain. He straightened his posture the way men do when they're preparing to defend something they already know is indefensible. He tucked his unloaded weapon back into its holster. He rolled his shoulders. He became, in the span of about 4 seconds, a performance of composure rather than the real thing. Deacon had gone back to Madison. He hadn't made a speech. He hadn't turned around and addressed the crowd. He'd simply walked back through the scattered chairs, through the ones Lawson had knocked over, which 2 of his brothers had already quietly set right, and he'd gone to her. He'd taken both of her hands in his, and she'd looked at him the way she always looked at him when things had been terrible, and were now maybe going to be okay. And she'd said very quietly, "Are you hurt?" "No," he said. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. Because I need you to be absolutely sure, Deacon, because I am not doing this wedding with a man who has been..." She stopped. Her voice had fractured slightly at the edge. She pressed her lips together and collected herself and tried again. "Are you completely sure?" "Completely," he said. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded once, with the decisiveness of a woman who has decided that the situation has taken enough of her day and it will not take any more of it. "Good," she said. "Then, let's finish this." Big Red, who had been standing approximately 4 feet behind Deacon's right shoulder for the past 15 minutes in the way that large, loyal men position themselves near people they love when danger is present, made a sound that was mostly exhale and partly something else. He put one enormous hand briefly on Deacon's shoulder. 1 second, no more, and then stepped back. "Preacher's still at the altar," Red said. "Been standing there this whole time. Didn't move an inch." Deacon looked toward the altar. Preacher Walsh was indeed still at his position behind the 2x4 structure, his book open in his hands. His expression, the unrattled calm of a man who has long ago made peace with the fact that the world is disorderly and that the appropriate response to that disorder is patience. When he caught Deacon's eye, he simply raised his eyebrows slightly as if to say, "Whenever you're ready." Deacon almost smiled. Almost. Because that was when Sheriff Daniel Hayes stepped out of his vehicle. Boy, that was a big man, not as big as Red, but substantial, with the kind of build that comes from physical work rather than a gym. Late 50s, gray at the temples, with a face that had absorbed a significant amount of weather and experience, and worn both with something that looked like honesty. He wore his uniform the way men wear things they've stopped thinking about, easily, without performance. He took off his hat as he stepped out of the vehicle. He looked across the property. He looked at the altar, at the assembled club members, at Madison in her white dress, at Evan Brooks standing awkward and pale near the patrol vehicles, at Richard Lawson, who was attempting to look like a man who had been doing exactly the right thing. And then he looked at Deacon. He looked at Deacon the way you look at someone you once thought you would never see again. He started walking, not toward Lawson, not toward Evan, straight toward Deacon. And behind him, Lawson's composure cracked down the middle. "Sheriff," he called out, moving to intercept. "Sir, I can explain the situation. We had what appeared to be an unlawful gathering of—" "Richard," Hayes said it without turning around or stopping walking. "Sir, the activity on the property raised a public safety concern, and I determined that—" "Richard," still walking, "stop talking." Lawson stopped talking. Hayes kept walking until he was standing in front of Deacon Whitmore. He was close, closer than strangers stand. He looked at him for a moment, a full moment, long enough that people watching felt the weight of it without knowing its source. Then Daniel Hayes, sheriff of the county, a man who had spent 30 years being the authority in every room he entered, reached out and pulled Deacon into an embrace. Not a handshake, not an embrace, arms around shoulders, real and complete. The kind of embrace that contains a history that the people watching it don't yet know. The desert went absolutely silent. 43 Hells Angels, one stunned younger deputy, one furious older deputy whose fury had nowhere left to go, a bride who had stopped breathing, and a preacher at an altar who had closed his book and was watching with an expression of quiet understanding, like a man who has learned to recognize the shape of grace when it appears, even when it appears in unexpected clothing. Hayes stepped back. His hands stayed on Deacon's shoulders for another second. His eyes were bright. "Cameron," he said, just that, one word. The given name, not Deacon, Cameron. "Daniel," Deacon said. Evan Brooks was watching this from 30 feet away and feeling the specific vertigo of a man whose understanding of a situation has just been rotated approximately 90 degrees without warning. He looked at Lawson. Lawson was staring at the sheriff and the biker, standing together like they were an equation that refused to balance. His jaw was set, but his eyes were doing something complicated. "Somebody," Evan said very quietly, mostly to himself, "is going to have to explain this to me." He didn't know that he was about to get more explanation than he'd bargained for. Hayes turned to face his deputies. He didn't rush to it. He stood at Deacon's side, literally at his side, which was itself a statement so loud it required no amplification. And he looked at Richard Lawson with the expression of a man who has been doing a job for 3 decades and understands, in his bones, the difference between law enforcement and the abuse of its cosmetic authority. "You want to tell me what happened here?" Hayes asked. Lawson began his version. It was organized and detailed and contained, at its surface, all the correct procedural language. Public safety concern, known criminal organization, failure to comply, escalation requiring defensive response. It had the architecture of a legitimate account. It was built on sand, and everyone present knew it, and Lawson knew it too. But the language was all there, arranged carefully, like furniture placed to cover damage in a floor. Hayes listened to all of it. He didn't interrupt. He didn't challenge. He just listened with his arms crossed and his eyes steady until Lawson was done. "That it?" Hayes said. "That's the situation as I assessed it, sir." Hayes was quiet for a moment. He looked at Evan. "Brooks, anything to add?" Evan hesitated. That hesitation lasted probably 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, Lawson cut a look at him that contained an entire silent argument, a warning, a plea, a command, all compressed into a glance. And Evan felt it. He felt the weight of it, the professional gravity of it, the implication of what it meant to contradict a senior officer, the implied cost of honesty in a system that often rewards its absence. He thought about Deacon standing with a gun at his chest. I thought about his own hands on the radio, shaking. Sir, Evan said, I would describe what happened differently. The look on Lawson's face could have stripped paint. Go ahead, Hayes said. And Evan told him, not everything, not yet, but enough. The chairs, the food, the way Lawson had moved through the property, the way he had spoken to Madison, the weapon, Deacon walking toward it, the words Deacon had said when the gun was at his chest. All of it, quietly, carefully, and completely. When he finished, the desert was very still. Hayes looked at Lawson for a long moment. Lawson met his gaze for about 3 seconds before he looked away, which was, in its own way, a complete answer to every remaining question. Richard, Hayes said, I want you to go sit in your vehicle. Sir, I don't think that wasn't a request. Go sit in your vehicle. I'll come talk to you shortly. Lawson stood still for one more second, the last stand of a man who has run out of positions to stand on. And then he turned and walked back toward the patrol car. Every step had the mechanical quality of controlled humiliation. Nobody watched him go. Out of a kind of mercy that he hadn't offered to anyone else that day, nobody watched him go. Hayes turned back to Deacon. I owe you an apology on behalf of this department, he said. You don't, Deacon said. You weren't here. My department was here. Same thing. Deacon looked at him steadily. Daniel, I've been apologized to by men who meant it and by men who were covering themselves. You don't need to be either right now. I know which one you'd be, and I'm telling you it is not necessary. Hayes was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face. Not quite grief, not quite gratitude. Something that lives between the two of those things and doesn't have a common name. You should have come back sooner, he said. I know. People around here, they forgot, or they never knew. They see the jacket and He stopped, started again. They don't know what I know. Most people don't know what you know, Deacon said. That's all right. Most people don't need to. Big Red had drifted closer during this exchange, as he tended to drift closer whenever conversations about Deacon's past emerged. Not to interfere, but with the protective instinct of a man who has watched someone he loves be misunderstood enough times that proximity feels like the only available comfort. He looked at Hayes with an expression that was cautious but not hostile. You're the sheriff he mentioned, Red said. The one from before. From before, Hayes confirmed. He looked at Red, then back at Deacon. How many of them know? Some, Deacon said, not all. Think they'd want to? Deacon considered that for a moment. He looked back at his assembled brothers, at the men who had stood still in the desert while a deputy knocked over their chairs and insulted their family and raised a weapon at their leader. At the men who had trusted him enough to do nothing when every instinct they had was screaming the opposite. Yeah, he said, I think they would. Hayes nodded once. He turned to face the assembled club members. He didn't use a commanding posture. He didn't perform authority. He just stood there, an ordinary man with a complicated story, and he began to tell it. 30 years ago, Hayes said, his voice carrying easily in the desert air, I was 26 years old. I was driving home on Route 9 after a night shift. It was late, past 2 in the morning. I came around a curve I'd taken 100 times, and there was water on the road from a busted irrigation pipe I didn't know about. He paused. I went into a drainage culvert. Vehicle caught fire. He said those words the way men describe things they've spent years putting distance between themselves and, plainly, factually, because the emotion is too old now to be performed, but still present enough that it surfaces in the specific way they choose their words. I couldn't get the door open. I couldn't get the window down. The smoke was, he stopped again, shorter pause. I was going to die. I knew I was going to die, and then somebody broke the window. The assembled men were completely silent, every one of them. Somebody I'd never seen before pulled me out, carried me to the edge of the road, and sat with me until the ambulance came. I kept asking his name. He kept telling me it didn't matter. By the time the paramedics had me loaded, he was gone. Hayes looked at Deacon. It took me 3 years to find out who it was. By then, he'd moved on. And he cleared his throat. I never got the chance to tell him what I should have told him. Preacher Walsh, at the altar, 30 feet away, put his hand over his mouth. Madison, standing beside Deacon, had stopped pretending that she wasn't crying. Big Red had his arms crossed and was looking at the ground with the specific expression of a man who is not going to cry and is employing significant resources to ensure that outcome. Deacon said nothing. He stood very still. This man, Hayes said, walked into fire for a stranger, for someone he owed nothing to. No obligation, no history, no reason in the world except that a person was in trouble and he was there and he could help. He looked at the assembled members. You want to know who you're riding with? That's who you're riding with. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Tommy Reyes, one of the youngest members, 24 years old, who had been standing near the back and had spent the last 40 minutes doing the controlled breathing exercise that Deacon had taught him for exactly this kind of situation, said out loud and without self-consciousness, "Man." It wasn't eloquent, but it was true. And in the specific silence that followed, it was exactly what was needed. Someone started to clap. Just one person at first, then two, then 10, then all of them, 43 men in the desert, clapping and calling out, not for a performance, not for a speech, but for a man they thought they knew and were now understanding they'd only partly known. Voices called out things that weren't quotable because they weren't composed. They were spontaneous, real, the kind of things men say when they stop performing toughness for a moment and say what they actually mean. Deacon turned around. He looked at his brothers, and for just a moment, one moment, visible to anyone who was watching closely enough, the composure he'd maintained through everything cracked slightly at the edges, not into grief, into something that was the opposite of grief, something that people in that desert would spend a long time afterward trying to describe and never quite managing to, because certain things don't have adequate language and perhaps aren't supposed to. He cleared his throat. You going to stay for the wedding? He asked Hayes. Hayes looked at Madison, who had been watching all of this with tears that had made her mascara do things she was going to address later. Looked back at him and said, absolutely he is. Hayes put his hat back on. I'd be honored. Deacon turned to Preacher Walsh. Preacher, he called. Walsh raised his eyebrows. Finally, he said in a tone of entirely theatrical exasperation that drew genuine laughter from men who had not been laughing 5 minutes ago. I have been standing at this altar for 45 minutes. My knees are not what they were. Can we please, at long last, conduct a wedding? More laughter, real laughter, the released, borderline helpless kind that comes out of people who have been through something and are now unexpectedly on the other side of it. Big Red was already picking up chairs and resetting them with the urgency of a man who has somewhere urgent to be and is 15 minutes behind schedule. He was speaking quietly and rapidly to the members nearest him, and they were moving with the coordinated efficiency of people who have learned to do things together without requiring a lot of instruction. Within 6 minutes, the wedding area was back in order. Within 7, the chairs were set. Within 8, the music started. It came from a portable speaker that one of the members had propped against a wooden post, playing something that Madison had chosen and that Deacon had not been permitted to hear in advance. It wasn't a traditional wedding march. It was something older, a song that had been written before most of the people present were born, with a melody that moved in the particular way of things that are simple and true and don't need to be complicated. Evan Brooks, still standing near his patrol vehicle, realized after a moment that he was listening to it, that he had stopped thinking about procedure and documentation and Lawson's report that was going to require his signature and had just stopped and was listening. He looked at Lawson sitting in the passenger seat of the patrol car, staring through the windshield at the wedding that was resuming without him. Evan thought about what Deacon had said to him. Because if I don't, the story people tell later isn't about what he did. It's about what I did. He thought about that for a long time. I thought about the version of today that Lawson had been constructing in his narration. Organized, procedural, technically coherent, and completely disconnected from the thing that had actually happened. He thought about how easy it would be to sign a report that described today in those terms. How easy and how wrong. How wrong in the specific way that small wrongnesses accumulate over years into something larger and more permanent than any single act. I thought about a young deputy making a career out of small wrongnesses. He thought about what that career looked like 30 years from now. And he thought about a man walking into fire for a stranger at 2 in the morning because a person was in trouble and he was there. He walked to the patrol car. He opened the door. He sat in the driver's seat and looked at Lawson. Lawson didn't look at him. The report, Evans said carefully. I'll need to be honest about what happened, what I observed, what I saw. He paused. I think you know that. Lawson's jaw tightened. I think, Evan continued, that whatever gets written down today is going to follow both of us for a long time, and I'd rather it be accurate. Silence. He walked toward this gun, Richard. Evan's voice was quiet but not soft. He walked toward your gun to protect his people, and he handed it back to you. He didn't have to do either of those things. Lawson was still staring through the windshield. His expression had changed repeatedly in the past 15 minutes. Through anger, through defiance, through the hard shell of justification. And now it had arrived somewhere new, somewhere quieter and less defended. The particular place a face arrives when the person wearing it has run out of stories to tell itself. I know what I saw, Lawson said. His voice was different now, quieter, smaller in some way that had nothing to do with volume. I know what kind of... He stopped. He stopped because the sentence he'd started required him to say something he was no longer sure he believed. I spent 22 years knowing what these men are. What are they? Evan asked. Lawson didn't answer. In the distance, from the wedding area, Preacher Walsh's voice carried on the desert air, clear and measured and warm, reading words that had been read at weddings for generations, unchanged by circumstance, unchanged by the peculiar day that had preceded them. Deacon was standing at the altar. Madison was standing beside him. Ranger was sitting at Deacon's feet, the white ribbon still around his neck, the one slightly bent ear giving him a perpetual air of alert amusement. Hayes was sitting in the front row where family sits, between two old Hells Angels members who had shifted without discussion to make room for him, with the natural ease of people who understand that family is a thing you earn rather than a category you're automatically assigned to. Preacher Walsh looked at Deacon. Do you, Cameron Whitmore, he said, take this woman, this extraordinarily patient woman who has waited 11 years and survived a significant additional complication this morning, to be your wife? Deacon looked at Matt. He didn't say anything for a moment, not because he was hesitating, because some moments deserve more than the minimum they require. Some moments deserve to be inhabited completely before you move through them. I do, he said. Walsh looked at Madison. And do you, Madison Cole, take this man, this extraordinarily stubborn man who apparently cannot have a simple outdoor ceremony without it becoming an entire situation. Preacher, Madison's voice was laughing and crying at the same time. To be your husband? I do, she said, and then added, with the particular combination of love and exasperation that characterized most of what she felt for Deacon Whitmore. God help me, I absolutely do. The desert erupted. Not in the controlled, polite way that wedding audiences respond, in the full, unrestrained way of people who have been through something together and arrived somewhere worth celebrating. Someone fired 2 shots into the air from a rifle, which Walsh had specifically asked them not to do, and which 2 members apologized for immediately, and which somehow made the moment more itself rather than less. Ranger barked once, sharp and clear, then thumped his tail. Deacon kissed Madison. And in the patrol car 30 yards away, Richard Lawson heard all of it. He heard the voices. He heard the celebration. He heard the life happening on the other side of a windshield. He could look through but not pass through, not today, not after today. He put his hands in his lap. He looked at them the way he'd looked at them earlier, that inspection that wasn't like him, that confrontation with the tools of his own actions. His hands which had reached for something they shouldn't have reached for. His hands which had been given back something they hadn't deserved to have returned. Evan watched him. I didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. Some understandings can only arrive through silence. Some reckonings can only complete themselves without assistance. He waited and he watched, and he let whatever was happening in Richard Lawson happen without interruption. After a long time, Lawson said, "How did he do that?" "Do what?" Evan asked. "Walk toward me." Lawson's voice was almost a whisper. How did he walk toward that? Evan thought about it. He thought about what Deacon had told him, standing still in the desert with his hands open. Because he'd already decided, Evan said slowly, what kind of man he was. Lawson was quiet. Before you even got here, Evan continued, before any of this, he'd already decided. So when it got hard, he didn't have to figure out who he was going to be. He already knew. Outside, the celebration continued. Inside the patrol car, two deputies sat with the particular weight of men who are accounting for something. One accounting for a decision already made and lived by, the other beginning the longer, harder accounting that comes after you've seen clearly, for the first time, the gap between who you thought you were and who you actually were. The food was being served. Someone had set the table back up, not just set it back, but straightened every cloth and repositioned every dish with care that bordered on ceremony. The same hands that had been prepared an hour ago for something very different. Hayes was talking to Big Red. They were the most unlikely pair of conversationalists, a county sheriff and a 6'4" former Army sergeant with tattoos covering most of his visible skin. And they were talking with the easy comfort of two people who have discovered an unexpected common ground and are slightly surprised by how much they enjoy standing on it. He never told any of you? Hayes asked. About you? No, Red said. He thought about it. Deacon doesn't talk about the things he's done, just does them. You know how those people are. I do, Hayes said. Yeah, I know exactly how those people are. Red looked at him sideways. How long did it take you to find out it was him? 3 years, and then it took me another 2 years to track down which chapter he'd joined, and then he'd moved on from that one. And then, Hayes shook his head. It became the thing I was going to do but never quite managed to do. You know how that goes. Yeah, Red said. Yeah, I know how that goes. I almost didn't come today, Hayes said. Red looked at him sharply. I mean, when Brooks called in with the situation, I almost sent another deputy. Almost let it resolve itself. Hayes paused. And then I heard the name. Red was quiet for a moment. Good thing you listened, he said. Good thing, Hayes agreed. Across the property, Deacon and Madison were moving through their people. Not cutting cake, not doing the formal processional things that weddings and other contexts demanded, but just moving together through the men and the women who had come to celebrate them. Stopping, talking, laughing at things. The particular ease of people who have survived something difficult together and are now on the other side of it and know, in the way you only know things that have been tested, that they are going to be all right. Madison had taken off her shoes. She was holding them in one hand and holding Deacon's hand with the other, walking barefoot across the desert ground that she'd earlier been standing on in ceremony, now just standing on in life, which is better anyway. You knew, she said to him. Knew what? That he was the sheriff here. You knew before today. Deacon considered that. I knew the name. I knew Hayes was sheriff. I didn't know it was the same Hayes until Brooks said the name and He paused. I recognized it. And you didn't say anything. What would I have said? She looked at him, the specific look she had for the specific flavor of his stubbornness that she found simultaneously infuriating and deeply, helplessly endearing. I don't know. Maybe Madison, the man whose life I once saved, is apparently now the sheriff of the town where we're getting married. Deacon thought about that. Would that have been a useful piece of information to have? She continued. In hindsight, he said, possibly. In hindsight, she repeated. Then she laughed. The full, real laugh, the one that started in her chest, the one that was entirely her and not a performance of any kind. Only you, Deacon Whitmore, only you could have a situation like today, and it turned out that the key to the whole thing was something you'd never bothered to mention. You married me anyway, he said. I married you anyway, she confirmed, which probably says something about me. It says everything I know about you, he said, and the way he said it, simple and true, without ornamentation, made her stop walking for a moment and look at him. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. Ranger had found them and was walking between them in the way of old dogs who require proximity to the people they love. His 3 legs managing the terrain with the practiced confidence of an animal who has long since stopped concerning himself with what he lacks. Hayes watched them from across the property. He'd been watching Deacon move through the celebration, watching the way his brothers came to him, the way he talked to each of them, the way he listened, the way he made each person feel, for the duration of the conversation, that they were the only person present. He'd been watching and feeling something that he hadn't expected to feel today, something that hadn't been on the schedule when he'd driven out here in response to a radio call. He'd expected relief. He'd expected resolution. Some version of closure on a 30-year debt that had weighed on him with the consistency of something structural. He hadn't expected to feel proud, but that was what it was. Looking at Cameron Whitmore moving through his people on his wedding day after a morning that would have broken most men. That was pride. The specific, almost paternal pride of someone who has witnessed a person be their best self under conditions specifically designed to prevent it. I thought about the young man who had broken a car window in the dark of a burning night on Route 9. The man who had said his name didn't matter and walked away before anyone could thank him. He thought about the man standing in the desert with a weapon against his chest, walking toward it rather than away, saying, "You'll have to go through me first." 30 years, same man. And Hayes thought, some people spend their whole lives trying to become who they already are. And some people are just already there, from the beginning. Like they arrived with something settled inside them that the rest of us spend decades still working on. He raised his cup. Someone had handed him food and a drink at some point, and he'd accepted both without registering it. And he said to nobody in particular, or perhaps to the desert, or perhaps to the memory of a burning night 30 years past that had ended differently than it could have. "Thank you." No one heard him. That was all right. It wasn't for anyone to hear. Across the property, Deputy Evan Brooks was walking toward the wedding area. He'd left his jacket in the patrol car. He'd left his radio on the seat. He was just a young man in a uniform shirt, walking toward a celebration he hadn't been invited to, but toward which he was being drawn by something he couldn't name, something that had to do with the accumulation of the last 2 hours and what they'd shown him about what he wanted his life to contain. He stopped at the edge of the gathering. He wasn't sure he should cross into it. Big Red appeared beside him. He looked down at the younger man, significantly down, given the height differential, and studied him for a moment with a particular assessment of someone who has learned to read people quickly, because slow reading has historically had consequences. "You the one who made the call?" Red asked. "Yes," Evan said. Red nodded, looked out at the gathering. "Good call," he said. "I should have made it sooner," Evan said. "Yeah," Red agreed without softening it. "You should have, again." He paused. "But you made it." Evan looked at him, at the enormous man with the forearms the size of most people's calves and the expression of someone who has decided in the past few minutes how they feel about this particular young deputy and has arrived at a verdict that is cautiously, conditionally, approximately positive. "Come get some food," Red said. It wasn't an elaborate invitation, but Evan followed him. Across the desert property that an old rancher named Gerald Pewitt had lent to a community that had built something there with their own hands, the celebration continued. The food was eaten. The stories were told. Not the story of today. Not yet, because some things need to settle before they become stories. But the older stories, the ones that bind people together, the ones about who they'd been and what they'd survived and how they'd found each other in the particular way that people find each other when they've stopped looking for comfortable and started looking for real. Deacon danced with Madison to no music in particular, just the sound of the desert and the voices of his brothers, and the distant sound of a road that led somewhere and also led back here to this place, to this moment. Ranger watched them. The white ribbon was still around his neck. He thumped his tail. The celebration had been going for 2 hours when Richard Lawson finally got out of the patrol car. Nobody saw him do it, or rather, several people saw him do it, because 43 Hells Angels veterans tend to maintain situational awareness even at a wedding reception, even after food and laughter, in the particular loosening that comes from surviving a morning like this one. But nobody acknowledged it. Nobody pointed. Nobody stopped what they were doing to track his movement. They simply noted it, the way experienced people note things, and continued their conversations. Lawson stood beside the vehicle for a moment. He'd been sitting in that car for 2 hours. 2 hours of watching through glass. 2 hours of listening to celebration that he had tried to prevent and that had happened anyway, with a fullness and a realness that the glass between him and it somehow amplified rather than diminished. There is a particular torture in watching something good happen that you almost destroyed. He'd had 2 hours to sit with that torture, and it had done something to him. Not fixed him. That would take considerably longer and considerably more work than 2 hours in a patrol car. But it had started something, like the first crack in ice that's been frozen for a very long time. He started walking toward the gathering. He wasn't sure why. He hadn't planned to. His feet made the decision before his mind caught up to it, which was perhaps the only way that decision could have been made. If he'd thought about it first, he would have convinced himself not to. He would have built a case. He would have told himself a version of it that allowed him to stay in the car until it was time to leave. But his feet went, and so he went. Big Red saw him come in first. His eyes tracked the movement the way a man's eyes track things when he spent years needing to know exactly who is approaching and from which direction. He watched Lawson walk across the property, the way his shoulders were set differently than they'd been that morning, the way his hands were down and open at his sides, which was either the most dangerous configuration or the most vulnerable one, depending entirely on context. Red read the context. He said nothing, but he positioned himself so that he was visible to Deacon without being obvious about it. Deacon was in the middle of a conversation with Hayes and 3 of the older members, a conversation about nothing consequential. The kind of conversation that happens in the aftermath of consequential things when people need to breathe. When he registered Red's positioning, he didn't turn, didn't interrupt the conversation. But some part of him cataloged it and began quietly to pay attention. Lawson stopped about 10 feet from the edge of the gathering. He stood there, not approaching further, not retreating, just standing, like a man who has arrived at a door he's been telling himself he'd never need to knock on and is now standing in front of it, trying to remember why he believed that. Tommy Reyes was the one who noticed him standing there. Tommy, who was 24 and still at the age where he responded to things more immediately than the older members had learned to. He saw Lawson and his jaw tightened, and he took a half step forward before an arm came across his chest. Not grabbing him, just present. The arm of a member named Carver, who was 41 and had learned, over many years and several regrettable incidents, the difference between responding and reacting. "Hold," Carver said. "He's got some nerve," Tommy said, low and tight. "He's got something," Carver said. "Wait and see what." Lawson was looking at Deacon. Deacon had turned now. He was looking back. The conversation with Hayes had stopped naturally, not interrupted, just suspended. And Hayes himself had turned to see what Deacon was looking at. When he saw Lawson, his expression changed into something that wasn't quite readable. Not anger, not welcome, the complicated expression of a man who is watching 2 things that he is responsible for in different ways, attempting to navigate toward each other. Nobody moved. This was a different kind of stillness than the stillness of that morning. That morning's stillness had been held in place by tension, by danger, by the coiled readiness of men who were controlling themselves through will. This stillness was different, quieter. The stillness of people who are waiting to see what a man is capable of when there's no advantage to be gained from it, when there's nothing to win, when all that's available is the decision of who to be. Lawson walked forward. He stopped in front of Deacon. He was close enough now that they were having a conversation, whether either of them spoke or not. The conversation of proximity, of presence, of 2 men who had been on opposite sides of something and were now standing in the same place without the structure that defined those sides. Lawson opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at the ground for a second, then back up, and Deacon watched him do all of this without expression, without hurry, without filling the silence with anything. Because Deacon Whitmore had learned, through decades of situations where patience was the only tool that worked, that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply wait for the person in front of you to find their way to what they need to say. "I don't have good words for this," Lawson said. His voice had lost the official flatness of that morning. It was just a voice now, a person's voice. I don't do this kind of thing well." "Take your time," Deacon said. Lawson looked at him with an expression that was very close to disbelief, that the man he had pulled a weapon on was standing here telling him to take his time. Something flickered in his face. Not a smile, but the place where a smile might appear in a different moment if enough things changed. "I was wrong today," Lawson said, "about what I thought, about how I acted." He paused. "About all of it." The desert was listening. Every person in that gathering was listening, and everyone was pretending very carefully not to be, because some moments deserve the dignity of apparent privacy, even when they're happening in front of 45 people. I've been doing this job for 22 years, Lawson continued, and I've had a picture in my head of what certain people are, what they mean, what they're capable of. He looked at the cut on Deacon's shoulders, the Hell's Angels patch, the colors that had defined everything he'd believed he knew that morning. I was wrong about the picture. Deacon was quiet for a moment. You're not the first, he said finally. That doesn't make it. No, Deacon agreed. It doesn't make it better. I'm not telling you it does. He looked at Lawson steadily. I'm telling you you're not the first, so you understand that this conversation has been had before. And the people who had it, on your side of it, some of them changed and some of them didn't. And the ones who came and stood here and said what you just said, that took something. Lawson's jaw worked for a moment. It's not enough, Lawson said. No, Deacon said. It's a start. Hayes stepped forward. He'd been standing 2 feet behind Deacon, watching this exchange with the expression of a man who has been doing a hard job for a very long time and occasionally, rarely, gets to watch something that makes it worth it. He put his hand on Lawson's shoulder. Not to comfort exactly, but in the way you put a hand on something to confirm it's real. Richard, he said, why don't you get some food? Lawson looked at him. Sir, go get some food, Richard. Eat something. Stand here, be a person. Hayes paused. You remember how to do that? It wasn't a question. It wasn't cruel. It was the specific tone of a man who still believes, after everything, in the capacity of people to be better than their worst moments. Who hasn't given up on that? Who perhaps has particularly good reason not to have given up on it, given what a stranger did for him on a dark road 30 years ago. Lawson looked at the food table. He looked at the men around it. Tommy Reyes was watching him with an expression that was still not warm, and might not be warm for a long time, and that was legitimate. But that had moved slightly away from its earlier position. Carver was eating and not looking at anything in particular, which was itself a form of permission. Lawson walked to the table. He took a plate. He put food on it. He ate standing up at the edge of things, not presuming to have been invited further in than he was. And that restraint, that particular reading of the room, that understanding of exactly how far he'd gotten and exactly how much further he hadn't earned, was noticed, was registered, was, by some of the men watching, quietly respected. Evan Brooks appeared at the table beside him. I didn't say anything. He just got food too, and stood nearby. And the two deputies ate together at the edge of a celebration that was slowly, incrementally, not making them quite as unwelcome as it had been entirely justified in making them. It wasn't forgiveness. It was something earlier than forgiveness. The thing that has to happen before forgiveness becomes possible. Acknowledgement. Presence. The willingness to stay in a place that's uncomfortable and not run from the discomfort and not explain it away. Small things, but in Deacon Whitmore's experience, which was considerable, almost all important things started as small things. He turned back to Hayes. You said you almost didn't come, Deacon said. I did say that. What made you finally find me? 3 years to get a name, 2 more to track down the chapter, and then you lost the trail. What made you pick it back up? Hayes was quiet for a moment. He was looking at Ranger, who had settled near the food table in the dignified manner of a 3-legged dog who knows exactly how to position himself for optimal outcome without being obvious about it. My wife, Hayes said. She got sick about 8 years ago. Nothing that killed her. She's fine. She's here. We've been married 34 years. But she was sick for a while. And lying in the hospital that first night, I thought about all the things I hadn't done. All the debts that were outstanding. He paused. Yours was the loudest one. Deacon nodded slowly. I hired someone to find you, Hayes said. Took a few months. When I got the address, I drove out and you'd moved on 18 months earlier. The people there knew the name Deacon, knew the club, didn't know much else. He half smiled. You cover your tracks. Habit, Deacon said. Good habit for some things, Hayes said. Inconvenient for others. He looked at him. I put the address in a folder. Told myself next time I had a lead, I'd follow it faster. Then Brooks called this morning. He stopped. When I heard the name, Cameron Whitmore, I thought I'd misheard. You hadn't. No, Hayes shook his head. I hadn't. They stood together for a moment in the comfortable silence of two people who have been trying to get to the same place from opposite directions and have finally improbably arrived. Then Deacon said, I didn't do it for a debt. I know that. I need you to know that because sometimes people, when they find out something like this, they start constructing a story where I did it for a reason, for recognition, for something. He looked at Hayes. I did it because you were there and I was there and you were going to die and I wasn't ready to let that happen. Hayes held his gaze. I know, he said. That's exactly why it mattered. That was when Madison appeared between them. She had the particular ability of certain women to materialize in the exact location where they're most needed, at the exact moment they're most needed, without having been summoned. She had a piece of wedding cake on a plate, actual cake, which someone had produced from a cooler because they'd remembered at the last minute and there had been a brief scramble that several people had been very quiet about. And she held it out to Hayes. This was supposed to happen 20 minutes ago, she said, but we got a little behind schedule today. Hayes took the cake. He looked at it, then at her, then at Deacon, and he laughed. The real laugh, the one that comes from somewhere below the professional register, the one that has to do with the specific absurdity of the day and the specific wonder of being here, alive, to experience it. Best wedding I've ever been to, he said. That's a low bar, Madison told him. It's not, though, Hayes said, and the way he said it made her stop mid-laugh, because it wasn't a pleasantry. He meant it. This is the best wedding I've ever been to, and I've been to 47. 47, she looked at him. 22 years of being sheriff, he said. You get invited to a lot of things. She considered this. We'll take it, she said. Now it was Preacher Walsh who was making his way through the gathering toward Deacon with the focused determination of a man who has been waiting to say something and has been patient about it for long enough. He was carrying his book, which he'd finally closed and tucked under his arm, and his expression was the particular combination of peaceful and purposeful that characterized the way he moved through the world on the days when he was most himself. Deacon, he said, reaching him, I need a word. Preacher, we're in the middle of, it'll take 30 seconds. Come here. Deacon came. Walsh pulled him slightly aside, not far, just enough, and turned to face him with the direct eye contact of a man who is about to say something he considers important and wants to make sure it lands correctly. 30 years ago, Walsh said, before I found God and all that, I was riding with you in Nevada. You remember that trip? Deacon frowned slightly. Las Vegas run, 94? 94, yes, we were outside Reno. Middle of the night. You remember what you told me? On the road outside Reno at 3 in the morning when I was about to do something very stupid that would have ended my career and possibly my life and possibly someone else's. Deacon was quiet, thinking back. I told you, he paused. I told you that you had more to give than this. That's right, Walsh said. I remember. And I didn't believe you, Walsh said. At the time, I thought you were just talking the way men talk when they want to talk someone down. He stopped. I believed you eventually, about 15 years later it turned out. But I believed you. Deacon looked at him. You say things to people, Walsh said, and you do things for people, and you don't file them away. You don't keep a record. You just do the next thing. 30 years ago, you said a thing to a stupid kid on a road in Nevada that eventually changed his entire life, and you don't even remember saying it. Preacher, I'm not done. Walsh's voice was firm, but not unkind. This morning you stood in front of a gun to protect your brothers. Yesterday you drove 6 hours to pick up the flowers Madison wanted that weren't available locally. Last spring you sat with Carver's father for 3 days when he was dying because Carver couldn't leave the hospital and the old man was afraid to be alone. He paused. You think I don't know these things? You think nobody notices because you don't announce them? Deacon said nothing. We notice, Walsh said. Every single one of us notices. He put his hand briefly on Deacon's arm. I just wanted you to know that, on your wedding day, before we all get any older and forget to say the things we should have said. Deacon looked at the older man. Something was happening in his face. The thing that happened occasionally, rarely, that almost nobody got to see. That slight dissolution of the composure. Not collapse, just thinning, transparency, the expression of a man who is being seen clearly and doesn't know how to receive it without it reaching him. You're going to make me... He stopped, cleared his throat. I know, Walsh said perfectly pleasantly. I'm very comfortable with that. Deacon put his hand briefly on Walsh's shoulder. He walked back toward Madison. She looked at his face when he reached her. She read it immediately, the way she always read him, with the fluency of 11 years and the specific attention of a woman who has loved someone long enough to know what his face is doing even when he thinks it isn't doing anything. You okay? She asked quietly. Preacher, he said. Said something important? Yeah. Good, she said. She took his hand. That's what preachers are for. The afternoon was moving. The sun had tracked its way across the sky with the indifference to human drama that the sun maintains regardless of what's happening below it, and the shadows were falling differently now. Longer, softer, the particular quality of desert light in the late afternoon that turns everything slightly golden and slightly mournful at the same time, though the morning is sweet rather than bitter when you are in the right company. Big Red had organized, without anyone asking him to and without announcing his intentions, a rough cleanup effort. He'd found in himself the post-event need for action that men of his specific type often find, the need to do something physical in the aftermath of something emotional. He was moving chairs and stacking them with the focused energy of a man processing feelings through labor, which is an extremely functional method that many men rely on and which Red had long ago stopped being self-conscious about. Tommy Reyes was helping him. They worked together in the way that men who don't know each other very well sometimes work together, efficiently, without a lot of conversation, building a wordless understanding through shared physical effort that might eventually become something more. Tommy handed Red a chair. Red stacked it. Red pointed to something that needed to be moved. Tommy moved it, back and forth, simple and rhythmic, while somewhere in Tommy's chest the events of the day were still being metabolized into something he'd understand better in a few weeks. Big Red, Tommy said after a while. Yeah. Today, he stopped, tried again. What he did, walking toward, he shook his head. How do you get to that? How does a person get to where that's what they do? Red set down the chair he was holding. He stood for a moment with his hands on his hips, looking at nothing in particular, applying the particular seriousness he reserved for questions that actually deserved it. You don't get to it, Red said. You either are it or you're not. Some people spend their whole life deciding who they are, back and forth, different every day, depending on what's in it for them. He paused. Some people decided a long time ago, and it's the same answer every day after that, no matter what the question is. Tommy thought about that. How do you know which one you are, he asked. Red looked at him. You asking me that question means you're probably the first kind. Tommy's face changed, not badly, not wounded, but thoughtfully. Processing. The expression of someone receiving information about themselves that they're not sure they agree with, but that they're not ready to dismiss either. But it can change, Tommy said. Right? You can decide. You can become the second kind. Red picked up the chair again. That's the whole point, he said. That's the whole damn point of everything. Across the property, Evan Brooks was in a conversation he hadn't expected to be in. He'd been standing near the edge of things, eating his food, watching the celebration with the expression of a man who is technically present, but emotionally still catching up to events, when Madison appeared beside him. Not Deacon, Madison. The bride herself, barefoot, with her shoes hooked on 2 fingers and her white dress trailing slightly, and her eyes still bright from crying and laughing and the particular exhaustion of a day that had been everything at once. You made the call, she said. Not a question. She knew. She'd been told, or worked it out the way she worked things out, which was quickly and accurately. Evan looked at her. Yes, ma'am. Don't ma'am me. I'm 38 years old. She said it without heat. How are you doing? And I mean that actually, not in the small talk way. He blinked. He started with the automatic fine and caught himself. I'm not sure yet, he said instead. Still working through it. That's honest, she said. I appreciate honest. She looked out at the gathering. You want to know something about Deacon? Yeah, he said. Yeah, actually, I think I would. He's going to remember your name, she said. I don't mean it as a threat or a warning. I mean, he's going to remember your name because he remembers the names of people who do the right thing in hard situations. He has a list. She smiled, and it was a real one. It's a shorter list than the other one, but it's the one that matters. Evan looked at her. What's the other list, he asked. The list of people who made the hard situation harder, she said. He doesn't hold on to that one. He never did, but it exists. Evan nodded slowly. I should have stopped it sooner, he said. Yes, she agreed, simply without softening it. But you stopped it. She walked away. Evan stood with that for a moment. Just stood with it. The specific weight of it. Not absolution, not condemnation, just the plain, unvarnished acknowledgement of what was true. He found to his surprise that he could stand under that weight, that it was bearable, that the accurate version of the day, held fully and without excuse, was somehow lighter than the distorted version would have been. Lawson was still at the edge of the gathering. He'd finished his food. He was holding his empty plate with both hands, looking at it, and Evan went to stand beside him, because the day had the quality of a day where the right things kept happening slightly before you decided to do them. And standing beside Lawson now felt like one of those right things. I want to transfer, Lawson said. Evan looked at him. Different department. Different county, maybe. Lawson's voice was flat, but not without feeling. The flatness of a decision that's been made in the last hour and is still settling. I need to not be here. Somewhere where people don't know what I did this morning. He paused. Where I have a chance to... He stopped. To what? Evan asked. Lawson looked at the gathering, at Deacon and Madison, at Hayes eating cake and laughing at something Red said. At Tommy Reyes, who was young and figuring things out, helping stack chairs in the afternoon light. To try, Lawson said. Evan looked at him for a long moment. I thought about all the things he could say. All the things about accountability and choices, and the things that followed people from county to county, regardless of geography. He thought about all of those things, and then he thought about Deacon saying, today could have been worse. Be thankful it wasn't. Okay, Evan said. Just that. Lawson nodded. They stood together in silence. It was Hayes who found them eventually. As the afternoon was growing later and the celebration had reached that particular phase where it moves naturally from loud to quiet, from collective to intimate, as people begin to sort themselves into smaller groups and conversations deepen, and the energy that has been sustaining everything starts to become something more sustainable. Hayes stood in front of Lawson. He looked at him for a moment. 22 years is a long time, Hayes said, and today was one day. Both of those things are true. Lawson met his eyes. Yes, sir. There's going to be a conversation about what happened, an official one. You know that. I know. What that conversation results in is partly up to you, Hayes said. What you say in it, how you say it, whether you say the true version or a version that protects you. Lawson's jaw was tight, but his eyes were clear. I'll say the true version. Hayes studied him. I believe you, he said. That counts for something. He paused. Not everything, but something. He walked away. Lawson exhaled. It was the exhale of a man who has been holding something for a long time and has finally been allowed to set it down, knowing that the setting down is not the end of anything, but the beginning of something considerably harder and considerably more real. Deacon had moved to a quieter part of the property. He was sitting on a wooden crate that someone had used for the setup and not moved. And Ranger was beside him, and he had a cup of coffee that Madison had brought him at some point, and that he was holding in both hands, but not drinking. He was looking at nothing, or looking at everything. Sometimes those are the same thing. Hayes came and sat beside him on a second crate. They sat without speaking for a long time. You did a hard thing this morning, Hayes said eventually. You did a hard thing 30 years ago, Deacon said, telling every new deputy that story, every class. Hayes looked at him. Who told you that? You'd be surprised what people know about a sheriff, Deacon said, especially when his name comes up on a radio. Hayes was quiet. Then, I never told it with your name. I didn't know your name. Not then. I told it as the story of a stranger. That's what you were. He paused. That's not what you are now. Deacon looked at him. What's it do? Deacon asked. When you tell it, to the new ones. Some of them get it, Hayes said. Some of them file it away and forget it. Some of them... He stopped. Some of them turn into Lawson, and some of them turn into Brooks. He looked at his coffee. And I never know which is which until a morning like this one. That's the job, Deacon said. That's the job, Hayes agreed. They sat with that. In the gathering behind them, the celebration was still going. Voices and laughter and the sound of someone, Tommy probably, attempting to get the portable speaker to play something that the older members were vocally uninterested in, and that was generating exactly the kind of good-natured generational argument that happens in communities that have enough trust to disagree without it meaning anything bad. Madison's voice cut through at one point, clear and laughing and decisive, and whatever the dispute was about, it ended. Deacon listened to her voice. Something in his chest shifted. 11 years, Hayes said. 11 years, Deacon confirmed. Worth the wait? Deacon looked at Hayes. Every day of it, he said, and every minute of this morning. Hayes smiled. She know the story about Route 9? She knows everything, Deacon said. She's always known everything. That's the only way I know how to do this. Hayes nodded slowly. Good woman, he said. The best, Deacon said, and then, quiet in the particular way that important things are sometimes said, without build-up, without preamble, without anything to mark them as the kind of words that last. Hayes said, thank you, for real. 30 years overdue, and I know it doesn't cover what it should cover, but thank you. Deacon held his gaze. He held it for a long time. You became a good sheriff, he said finally. You protected people. You taught people. You built something. He paused. That's thanks enough. Hayes swallowed. He looked away. They sat there together, the sheriff and the biker, the man who was saved and the man who saved him, on wooden crates at the edge of a desert wedding that had survived the worst of the morning and emerged as something none of them could have anticipated. And they sat until the voices behind them grew quieter and the light kept changing, and Ranger leaned against Deacon's leg and went to sleep. And somewhere in the gathering, Tommy Reyes found Evan Brooks and they talked, not about what had happened, not directly, not yet, but about other things, small things. The way young men sometimes talk around the big thing that's really happening, circling it, getting closer in degrees, building toward it. Tommy had questions, Evan had some answers, and some other questions, and that combination turned out to be enough for a beginning. Small things. Always the small things first. Lawson had stayed. That was what mattered at the end of the afternoon. Not that he'd made it right, not that he'd fixed anything, because those things weren't available to him on the same day that the wrong happened. But he'd stayed. He'd eaten the food and stood at the edge and endured the discomfort and not run from it. And when Hayes had spoken to him, he'd answered honestly. And when the gathering was beginning to wind down and people were saying their goodbyes and the older members were starting to talk about the road ahead, Lawson walked to Deacon. I didn't have words this time either. He'd used his words earlier and they'd been inadequate and he'd known they were inadequate. And he was done pretending that words could do this particular job. So he did something that was not his habit, was not in his catalog of behaviors, was not something he would have predicted about himself at any point during the 22 years he'd been doing this job. He extended his hand, he held it out. Not a handshake that asked for something in return. Not a handshake that expected anything. Just a hand held out, in the oldest gesture available to human beings for signaling that you are not a threat and would like, if possible, not to be treated as one. Deacon looked at the hand. He looked at Lawson's face. He took it. One shake, firm, brief, complete. Lawson nodded once. He walked back to his vehicle. He drove away. The desert was beginning to quiet. The last of the light was changing. And Deacon Whitmore stood with his wife beside him and his dog at his feet, and his brothers around him, and the sheriff of the county somewhere nearby. And he looked at the altar that Red had built, and the chairs that had been knocked over and reset, and the table where food had been served and eaten, and the whole complicated wreckage and rescue of this particular day. And he felt something that was difficult to name precisely, but that lived in the vicinity of gratitude. Deep, earned, inconvenient gratitude of the kind that only comes from having almost lost something and then finding it again, slightly changed by the almost losing, more real for having been tested. Madison leaned into him. He put his arm around her. Ranger slept. The road that Gerald Pewett's property bordered carried, in the far distance, the sound of Lawson's vehicle heading back toward town. Heading back to a department he'd said he was going to leave. Heading back maybe toward a version of himself that the day had made possible. Not guaranteed, not inevitable, but possible. That was all any day could do. Make something possible that wasn't possible before. Behind them, Red was finishing the chairs, whistling something tuneless and happy. the way big men whistle when they've worked and things are right. Tommy Reyes was helping him. 2 chairs, side by side, stacked together. 3 weeks after the wedding, the story leaked. Not from Deacon, not from Madison, not from Hayes, who understood instinctively that some things belong to the people who live them before they belong to anyone else. It leaked the way things always leak in small towns, through proximity, through overheard conversations, through the particular inability of human beings to hold on to something extraordinary without eventually needing to share it. Someone who'd driven past the property that morning had seen the patrol cars and the leather cuts and told someone who told someone else, who told someone who worked at the county clerk's office, who told her cousin, who told 3 people at church on Sunday, and by the following Wednesday, the version circulating through town had been elaborated in the way that small-town stories always get elaborated. Some details dropped, others magnified, the emotional core intact, but the specifics loosened from their moorings. What the town heard was this: a Hells Angels wedding had been interrupted by a deputy. The deputy had pulled a weapon. The biker leader had walked toward the gun instead of away from it, and the sheriff had shown up and embraced the biker in front of everyone. That part at least was accurate. What the town didn't hear, not yet, was why. And in a town where why is the most important word in any story, that absence created a vacuum that curiosity rushed to fill. Hayes became aware of the circulating story on a Thursday morning when his deputy dispatcher, a meticulous woman named Carla, who tracked the social temperature of the county, the way other people tracked weather, appeared in his doorway with a specific expression on her face. "Sheriff," she said, "the phone has been ringing since 7. About? The wedding." Hayes leaned back in his chair. "What are people saying?" "Depends who you ask," Carla said. "About half think you lost your mind. The other half want to know the story." She paused. "And about 6 people have called asking whether Cameron Whitmore is the same Cameron Whitmore who," she consulted a note, "helped at the Henderson fire in 2019, and the same one who paid the Garza family's property taxes anonymously 2 years ago when they were about to lose the house." Hayes looked at her. "People know about that?" he said. "People know about all kinds of things," Carla said. "They just haven't had a reason to connect them before." Hayes thought about this for a moment. He thought about what Deacon had said, that he didn't file things away, didn't keep a record, just did the next thing. He thought about the accumulation of next things over 11 years in and around this county, the fire, the taxes, whatever else was out there that hadn't surfaced yet. He thought about a man who had been called a criminal for 2 decades and had spent that same 2 decades quietly doing things that contradicted that label, without ever announcing it, without ever asking for it to change anything. "Get me Whitmore's number," Hayes said. Carla had it on a piece of paper already. She'd had it on a piece of paper for 3 days. She set it on his desk without comment, in the manner of someone who is excellent at her job and knows it. Hayes called. Deacon picked up on the second ring. "Story's out," Hayes said. A pause. "I heard. Incomplete version, missing the important part." "Stories usually are," Deacon said. "People are asking questions about you specifically, about things you've apparently done in this county that nobody connected to a name before." Hayes paused. "I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to answer me directly." "Go ahead. Is there a reason you've been operating in this area for 11 years without making yourself known? To me specifically, knowing I'd been looking." The pause on the other end was longer this time. "Yeah," Deacon said finally, "there is." "Tell me." Another pause. Not evasion. Deacon Whitmore didn't evade. The pause of a man choosing his words with care because the words matter and getting them right matters. "If I'd come to you," Deacon said, "it would have become a transaction. You would have felt like the debt was paid. I would have felt like I'd been paid. And both of us would have moved on." He stopped. "I didn't want to be paid. I wanted to be here. I wanted to do the things that needed doing. Not because you owed me anything, because the place needed them done." Hayes sat with that. "You knew I was looking," Hayes said. "I knew. And you stayed anyway." "I stayed," Deacon confirmed, "because this is where Madison is from, because Gerald Poot is the best man I've known in 20 years who didn't ride with me. Because Tommy Reyes needed someone to ride with who wouldn't let him get killed before he figured out who he was." His voice was matter of fact, the way he said everything. Not because it was small, but because he'd made his peace with it being what it was. Because there were reasons to stay that had nothing to do with debt. Hayes closed his eyes for a moment. He opened them. The Garza family, he said. Don't. The Henderson fire, you were there for 6 hours. You pulled 3 people out of that building before the fire department. Daniel, Deacon's voice was patient but firm. I'm asking you not to make a list. People deserve to know. People deserve a lot of things they don't get, Deacon said. And some people get things they don't deserve. That's true, but building a public record of everything I've done isn't going to change either of those facts. It's just going to change what people think they owe me, and I don't want that. Hayes pressed his hand flat on his desk. The town is already talking, he said. I can't stop that. I know you can't. So what do you want me to do? The silence stretched. Tell the truth, Deacon said. About the wedding, about Route 9, the real story. Not a version that makes me a hero and not a version that makes Lawson a villain. The true one, with all the parts that are uncomfortable. He paused. And then let people do what people do with true things. Which is what? Hayes asked. Whatever they're capable of, Deacon said. Hayes stared at the wall. You know, he said, you're a very frustrating man. Madison tells me that regularly, Deacon said. And Hayes could hear, even through the phone, the particular quality in his voice when Madison's name came up. The involuntary warmth, the thing that happened to a person's voice when they were talking about the best thing in their life. I take it as a compliment. She's a wise woman, Hayes said. Wisest I know, Deacon said. They agreed to meet the following Monday. Hayes had a proposal. Not a public ceremony, not a news conference, nothing that would turn Deacon into an exhibit or a spectacle or a redemption narrative for someone else's consumption. Something quieter, something true. He spent the weekend thinking about how to do it right. On Saturday, his wife Elena sat across from him at the kitchen table and watched him think with the patience of a woman who has been watching her husband think through hard problems for 34 years and has learned to identify the specific quality of thought that means the problem is important. Tell me, she said. He told her. Everything, Route 9, the wedding, Lawson, Evan Brooks. The list of things Deacon had apparently done in this county for 11 years without a name attached. All of it. Elena listened without interrupting. She was a listener, had always been, was the reason Hayes had become a better talker over their marriage. Because when someone listens with genuine attention, it teaches you to say things more completely. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. What are you afraid of? She asked. He looked at her. What do you mean? You've been sitting here all morning looking like a man who's afraid of something, she said. I know that look. I've seen it for 34 years. What is it? He thought about it. And getting it wrong, he said. He trusted me with something. With the story. With the way it gets told. He paused. He said tell the truth. But truth can be used badly. The wrong emphasis. The wrong framing. It becomes a different thing. Elena nodded slowly. Then you tell it the way he'd tell it, she said. Hayes looked at her. How would he tell it? She said. Not a hero story. Not a tragedy, just what happened and why it mattered and what it asks of the people hearing it. She paused. You know how he'd tell it. You've been listening to him for 3 weeks. You know who he is. Hayes thought about Deacon standing with a gun at his chest and his hands open. He thought about the way Deacon had spoken to Lawson after, without triumph, without malice. Today could have been worse. Be thankful it wasn't. He thought about the way Deacon had talked about the Garza family, about Tommy Reyes, about the reasons for staying in this county that had nothing to do with recognition. Just the next thing, just the thing that needed doing. Yeah, Hayes said slowly. Yeah, I know how he'd tell it. Elena picked up her coffee cup. Then stop being afraid and go tell it, she said. The Monday meeting happened in the back room of a diner on Main Street called Sullivan's, which had been in the same family for 40 years, which served coffee in mugs that weighed about half a pound each, which smelled like bacon and old wood in proportions that constituted a kind of perfection. It was Hayes's choice of venue. Deacon approved it without hesitation. They brought Madison. They brought Big Red, because Deacon rarely made decisions of consequence without Red nearby. They brought Evan Brooks, which surprised Red until Deacon explained his reasoning. He's the one who made the call. He should be part of what comes after. They did not bring Lawson. Lawson had submitted his transfer request. Hayes had approved it. He was moving to a department 3 counties north in 30 days, not running or not entirely running, and maybe the distinction mattered and maybe it didn't. But he'd told Hayes on Friday that he intended to do things differently, and Hayes had believed him with the specific, cautious quality of belief that a man earns when he hasn't yet done the things that would make belief unconditional. They sat at a round table in the back room of Sullivan's, and they drank coffee from the half-pound mugs, and Hayes told him what he'd been thinking. "I'm not doing a press conference," and he said. "I'm not calling the paper. I'm not turning this into—" He gestured vaguely to indicate all the ways a story could become a product. "Whatever this is, it stays what it is." "Then what?" Red asked. He was wrapping both hands around his mug in the manner of large men who find correctly sized objects deeply satisfying. "I want to talk to the department," Hayes said. "All of them. The full roster, new recruits and veterans. I want to tell them the story, Route 9, the wedding, all of it. True version." He looked at Deacon. "With your permission." Deacon was watching him carefully. "And," he said, because he knew there was an and. "And I want you there," Hayes said, "not to speak, not to perform, just to be there, so they can see that the man in the story is real. So it's not a cautionary tale about a hypothetical. So it's," he stopped, found the right word, "accountable to a real person who's sitting in the room." Silence at the round table. Madison was looking at Deacon. Red was looking at Deacon. Evan was looking at his coffee because he understood that this particular moment didn't include him in the same way it included the others, and he was still young enough to know the difference. Deacon looked at Hayes. "The recruits," he said. "How young?" "Youngest is 22, Hayes said. Deacon nodded slowly. "Tommy Reyes is 24, he said, not as a comparison, as a thought he was having out loud. Something about that age, something about what it means to be that age and hear a certain kind of story, or not hear it, and how that absence shapes the kind of person you become." "Deacon," Madison said. He looked at her. "You don't have to," she said. "You know that. You don't owe him this." "I know," he said. "But—" He looked at her for a long moment, then at Hayes, then at Evan Brooks, who was still studying his coffee with the careful attention of a man who is trying very hard not to influence a decision that isn't his to influence. "Evan," Deacon said. Brooks looked up. "What would it have meant to you," Deacon said, "if you'd heard this story before the wedding, before all of it, if someone had told you this story when you were 22 years old and just starting out?" Evan opened his mouth. He closed it. He thought about it honestly. Not the answer that sounded right, but the actual answer, which required him to think about who he had been at 22 and what had shaped him and where the gaps in his formation were and what might have filled them. "Everything," he said. His voice was quieter than usual. "It would have meant everything." The table was still. Deacon looked at Hayes. "Okay," he said. "I'll be there." Hayes exhaled. Red set down his mug. Madison reached across the table and put her hand briefly over Deacon's. The specific touch that meant, "I see you making this decision, and I'm with you in it," and then pulled it back because some decisions a person has to sit with alone, even when they're not alone. "One condition," Deacon said. "Name it," Hayes said. "You tell the real story, not the version where I'm the hero and Lawson's the villain, not the version where the bikers were the noble savages and the deputy was the corrupt authority. That's not what happened." He paused. "What happened is that a man with incomplete information made a bad decision. What happened is that other men with better character made better decisions. What happened is that nobody in that desert was simple, and the story isn't simple, and if you flatten it into something simple, it loses the only thing that makes it worth telling." Hayes held his gaze. "I know," Hayes said. "Say it back to me." Hayes didn't blink. "A man with incomplete information made a bad decision. Other men with better character made better ones. Nobody was simple. The story isn't simple." Deacon nodded once. "Good," he said. "Then we're square." The department meeting happened on a Wednesday morning, 2 weeks later. 41 officers in a room that was slightly too small for 41 officers, with folding chairs arranged in rows and a podium at the front that Hayes stood behind for approximately 90 seconds before deciding the podium was wrong for this and stepping out from behind it. He stood in front of his department without the podium between them, and he said, "I'm going to tell you something that happened to me, and then I'm going to introduce you to someone, And then I want you to sit with it. You don't have to say anything. You don't have to perform any particular response. Just sit with it. He told it straight. Route 9, the fire. The hands that broke the window. The man who said his name didn't matter and was gone before the ambulance closed its doors. 3 years to find the name. 2 more years tracking the chapter. The folder in his desk that had moved from office to office across 20 years of his career. Always present, always waiting for him to do the thing he kept meaning to do. The wedding. The radio call. Brooks saying the name. I didn't embellish. He didn't dramatize. He said it the way Deacon would have said it, plainly with the facts, trusting the facts to carry the weight without needing theatrical assistance. When he got to the part with the gun, the room changed. He felt it. The collective shift. 41 people recalibrating, readjusting their understanding of what they were hearing. A few people looked at each other. Most kept their eyes forward. The man walked toward the weapon, Hayes said, not away from it. He walked toward a drawn firearm pointed at his chest to position himself between his people and what might happen. And then he talked the officer down. And I want you to understand this clearly, he handed the weapon back. He handed it back and he said, today could have been worse. Be thankful it wasn't. Hayes paused. He didn't punish. He didn't retaliate. He didn't use the situation to gain any advantage. He handed the weapon back and he turned around and he went to get married. The room was completely silent. In the back corner, Deacon sat. He'd come in quietly before the officers arrived and taken a chair in the back row against the wall, which was where he always sat in rooms that weren't his because it gave him the full field of view and put his back to something solid. Red was beside him. Madison was beside Red. Evan Brooks was in the second row, in uniform, sitting with his fellow officers, the only person in the room who had been in that desert. Hayes said, I'd like to introduce you to Cameron Whitmore. 40 heads turned. The moment of recognition, of the abstract becoming concrete, of the story meeting the person, moved across the room visibly. You could trace it face by face. The adjustment, the reconsideration, the particular look of people who had been building an internal image of someone and are now being asked to revise it against reality. Deacon stood. He didn't move forward. He just stood. He let them look. I was wearing his cut, deliberately, consciously, with the full understanding of what it communicated and what it cost him in first impressions and what it said, by its presence in this specific room that he needed it to say. He wore his cut because the whole point was that the cut and the man wearing it were the same thing, that you couldn't separate them into comfortable and uncomfortable, into the part you approved of and the part you didn't. That real understanding required you to hold both at once. He nodded once at the room. He sat back down. Hayes said, I'm not telling you this story so you'll think differently about motorcycle clubs. I'm not telling you this story to make a political point or push an agenda or make anyone in this room feel bad about assumptions they've made. He looked at his department, at the veterans, the rookies, the women who had come into this job through different paths than the men who had come in with fathers who'd done it before them, the officers who had been good at this for years, and the ones who were still figuring out what good meant. I'm telling you this story because in 20 years of doing this job, I have never seen a clearer example of what character looks like when it costs something. When doing the right thing doesn't benefit you, when nobody's watching and there's no reward, and the situation is specifically designed to push you toward the wrong choice. He stopped. That man, he said, chose correctly every single time. Every decision point in that desert, he chose correctly, under conditions that would have made most people, including most of us, choose differently. Another pause. I want you to think about why, and I want you to think about what it would take for you to do the same. He thanked them. He sat down. The room was quiet for a long moment. Then a young officer in the third row, a woman named Diaz, 24 years old, 7 months on the job, raised her hand. Hayes nodded at her. Can I ask him something? She said. Mr. Whitmore? Every head turned again. Deacon looked at her. Go ahead. Were you scared? She asked. When you walked toward the gun, were you scared? The room held its breath. Deacon looked at this young officer for a moment, 24 years old, 7 months in, asking the question that every single person in the room wanted answered, and that most of them were too composed or too strategic to ask. Yes, he said, simply and completely. Diaz looked at him. How did you do it anyway? Because being scared wasn't the most important thing in the room, he said. My people were the most important thing in the room. Keeping that officer from doing something he could never take back was the most important thing in the room. He paused. The fear was real. I'm not telling you it wasn't, but it wasn't running the decision. Diaz nodded slowly, processing. What was? She asked. Deacon looked at her with the focused attention he gave to questions that deserved it. Who I already was, he said. The room sat with that. In the second row, Evan Brooks was looking at the floor with an expression that was entirely internal. A conversation happening inside him that didn't show on his face except in the specific tension around his eyes and the slight tightening of his jaw that meant something was landing that he hadn't been ready for. I thought about the morning of the wedding, about himself in it, about the decisions he'd made and the ones he'd been slow to make, about his hands on the radio, finally, shaking, about Deacon's words in the desert. Because if I don't, the story people tell later isn't about what he did. It's about what I did. He thought about who he'd already been that morning. He thought about who he wanted to already be going forward. After the meeting, the officers filed out. Some of them stopped near Deacon. Not all, not most, but enough. Some shook his hand. Some just made eye contact in a way that communicated something they didn't have language for. Diaz stopped and said, "Thank you for coming," with the simplicity of someone who meant it without ornamentation. And Deacon said, "Thank you for asking the right question." And she looked startled and then pleased in the way of young people who've been told they did something right by someone whose opinion has just become unexpectedly important to them. Hayes found Deacon near the door afterward. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Like I talked about myself for 45 minutes, Deacon said, "which I don't love." "It wasn't about yourself," Hayes said. "You know that." "I know what it was about," Deacon said. "Doesn't change how it feels." He looked at Hayes. Did it land with the ones who needed it to? Hayes thought about Diaz and her question. He thought about two other officers who had stayed seated a beat too long after everyone stood, who had the expression of people who'd been hit somewhere important and were sitting with the hit. He thought about a veteran sergeant in the back who had been on the job for 19 years and who, after the meeting, had stood in the hallway for a long time before going anywhere, just standing there, which was significant because that sergeant was not a man who stood in hallways. "Yeah," Hayes said, "it landed." "Good," Deacon said. "That's enough." Red appeared with the truck keys. Madison appeared with her jacket and a look that said she was ready to go, and also that she was proud of him, and also that she was going to tell him that later, at home, where he couldn't deflect it with practicalities. Evan Brooks caught Deacon at the door. "I want to tell you something," Evan said. Deacon waited. "I've been thinking about what I could have done differently," Evan said. "That morning, the moment I should have stepped in before I did, I've been going back over it, every step, trying to figure out where the line was." "And?" Deacon said. "I think I knew," Evan said. "I think I knew before it escalated. I think there was a moment early when he first knocked the chair, when I knew. And I let it go anyway, because it was easier, because stepping in would have made things complicated in ways I didn't want to deal with." He met Deacon's eyes. "And I keep thinking about what you said. That being scared wasn't the most important thing in the room." Deacon looked at him. "My people were the most important thing in the room," Evan said. "The people in that desert, they were my people too. Not just yours. The moment I put on this uniform, everyone in that desert became mine to protect." His voice was even, but not without feeling. "Including you, including your wife, including your dog." He paused. "I was slow, and I'm going to be faster." Deacon studied him for a long moment. "You're going to be a good officer," he said. Evan blinked. "I'm not telling you that to be kind," Deacon said. "I'm telling you because the ones who actually become good at this job are the ones who can hold themselves accountable without it destroying them. There's a version of what you just said that turns into punishment, into making yourself smaller, beating yourself down, and there's a version that turns into fuel." He looked at Evan steadily. "Yours is the second kind. I can hear it." Evan swallowed. "How?" he said. "How can you hear the difference?" "Experience," Deacon said simply, "and age, both of which you are going to accumulate if you stay honest." He put his hand briefly on Evan's shoulder. The same gesture Red made, that Walsh had made, the language of men who are trying to transfer something important through the most direct available channel. "Don't waste the morning. He walked out. Red and Madison fell in beside him. The three of them walked to the truck in the morning light and got in, and Red drove, the way Red always drove when Deacon needed to not be doing something with his hands. And for a while, nobody said anything. The radio was off. The road was quiet. The distance between the sheriff's department and the motel where they were staying 2 more days before heading home unreeled steadily under the truck's tires. Then Madison said, "That young officer, Diaz." "Yeah," Deacon said. "She's going to be something," Madison said. "Yeah," Deacon said. "She is." Red made an affirmative sound from the driver's seat. He'd been watching Diaz during the meeting with the particular attention he gave to young people who showed signs of growing into something worth watching. That assessment that Red made early, and that was almost always right. Not because Red was infallible, but because he paid the kind of attention that most people didn't have the patience for. "Going to be some people in that room," Red said, "who walk through a door differently because of today." "Maybe," Deacon said. "Not maybe," Red said. "I saw their faces. Some of those people are going to handle something better than they would have, make a call they might not have made, hold back when they should hold back, or step forward when they should step forward." He paused. "That's on you." "That's on Hayes," Deacon said. "He's the one who told the story." "He told a story about you," Red said. "That's different." He glanced over. "You know that's different." Deacon looked out the window. He didn't answer, because Red was right, and both of them knew it, and saying so wouldn't add anything. The truck moved through the town that Deacon had been operating in for 11 years without a name. The town that now had his name attached to things it hadn't previously known he'd touched. The Garza house was somewhere to the east. The Henderson building, repaired now, was to the north. Gerald Pruitt's property was south, already beginning to resume its ordinary character. The built things dismantled, only the land remaining, indifferent and permanent. Deacon looked at none of these things specifically. He looked at the road ahead. The same road he'd been on for 30 years, in different forms, in different states, on different machines. Always this road, the one that went somewhere and also went back, that led away and also led toward, that he'd been traveling since the night on Route 9 when he'd stopped for a burning car in a stranger's life and started being, without fully knowing it, the thing that he was going to spend the rest of his life being. Madison was watching him. She reached over and put her hand on his arm. He looked at it. He put his hand over hers. "You did a good thing today," she said quietly. "I did a thing," he said. "You did a good thing," she said with the particular firmness of a woman who has been arguing for the correct version of events for 11 years. "And you're going to accept that." He looked at her. "Okay," he said. She squeezed his arm. Red kept driving. The road kept going. And somewhere behind them, in a room that was being folded back into its ordinary purpose, 41 officers were going back to their days carrying something they hadn't carried when they walked in. Some of them knowing exactly what it was, some of them not knowing yet but feeling its weight, and a few of them, Diaz, a veteran sergeant who'd stood too long in the hallway, 2 rookies who'd never forget this particular Wednesday morning, carrying it in a way that would eventually show up in a decision made at the right moment, in a hesitation that prevented something terrible, in a choice correctly made when the situation was specifically designed to push toward the wrong one. They would never know, most of them, that it was Deacon who put it there. He wouldn't know about most of them. That was how it worked. That was always how it worked. The next thing, the thing that needed doing, the road ahead. Always the road ahead. 6 months after the wedding, Tommy Reyes made a decision that would have gone differently if the desert morning had never happened. I was on patrol, routine traffic stop, late on a Tuesday night, a vehicle with a broken taillight on the county road outside town. He ran the plates before he got out of the car, the way he'd been trained. The car came back clean. He walked up and the driver was young, 19, maybe 20, with the particular combination of nervousness and studied casualness that young men deploy when they've been taught to be afraid of this exact moment. Tommy looked at him. I didn't see a threat. He didn't see a criminal. He saw a kid who was scared of a broken taillight and of the person walking toward him with a badge and a gun, and who was managing that fear the only way he knew how. Tommy had a choice in that moment. He'd had choices like it before. Before the wedding, before the desert, before the morning that had rearranged something fundamental in his understanding of what his job actually was. Before he might have leaned on the nervousness, pressed a little, used the fear as a tool the way he'd seen it used, the way he'd been implicitly taught it could be used. Instead, he said, "Your taillight's out on the left side. Get it fixed this week. You won't hear from me again." He handed the kid his license back. He walked to his car. He sat in his car for a moment after the other vehicle drove away, and he thought about Deacon Whitmore standing in the desert with his hands open and a gun at his chest. And he thought about Big Red saying, "You can decide. You can become the second kind." He thought, that's what I just did. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody saw it. There was no moment of recognition, no witness, no one to confirm that he'd done something worth doing. Just a kid with a broken taillight, driving home, and a deputy sitting in a parked car at night, and a decision made in a direction that cost nothing except the willingness to not use power when power wasn't the right tool. Tommy called Deacon that night, not because he needed to, because he wanted him to know. Deacon picked up on the third ring. "You need something?" he said. Not unfriendly, just direct, the way he answered late calls. "No," Tommy said. I did something tonight, and I wanted to tell you." He told him about the taillight, the kid, the choice. When he finished, the phone was quiet for a moment. Then Deacon said, "Good. Just that." "You're not going to say anything else?" Tommy said. "What else do you want me to say?" "I don't know, something bigger." "Tommy." Deacon's voice had the patient quality it carried when he was about to say something that didn't benefit from ornamentation. "You made the right call. That's what's supposed to happen. It doesn't need to be big. That's the whole point. If it needed to be big every time, you'd only do it when people were watching." Tommy sat with that. "It felt different," Tommy said, "than before." "I know," Deacon said. "It'll keep feeling different. And eventually it'll feel normal. And when it feels normal, that's when you know it's stuck." They talked for a few more minutes about nothing important, about the road, about the next run the club was planning, about a bike that Red was rebuilding and refusing to let anyone else touch under penalty of significant personal consequence. Normal things. The texture of ordinary life that surrounds extraordinary moments and makes them possible. Before he hung up, Tommy said, "Deacon." "Yeah, that morning, at the wedding. How long did it take for it to stop being something you thought about every day?" A pause. "Who said it stopped?" Deacon said. And then he was gone. Tommy held the phone for a long moment. "I thought about a man who had carried a burning stranger out of a car on Route 9 at 2 in the morning and who still, 30 years later, carried the morning in him the way you carry things that mattered. Not as a burden, not as a trophy, just as part of the continuous record of who you'd chosen to be." He thought, that's the real inheritance. Not the story, not the reputation, not the version that circulated through the county and accumulated detail, an occasional inaccuracy as it passed through more and more people who hadn't been there. The inheritance was the decision, made once by one and then made again, and then again, every day, in moments large and microscopic, until it stopped being a decision at all and became simply who you were. Alina Hayes had asked her husband, 2 weeks after the department meeting, whether he thought it had worked. They were at the kitchen table again, the kitchen table that had become, over 34 years, the location where the serious conversations happened, where the real accounting was done, where Daniel Hayes came when he needed to think out loud to the person who knew how to listen. "I don't know yet," he said. "How will you know?" "I'll know when something happens," he said. "When a call comes in and somebody handles it differently than they would have before. When somebody makes a call they wouldn't have made. When somebody holds back or steps forward in a way that tells me something landed." He paused. "You don't always get to see it. Some of it goes out and you never know what happened downstream." Elena nodded. "But some of it you do see," she said. "Some of it," he agreed. The first sign came 4 months later when Officer Diaz responded to a call at a rally. Not Hells Angels, an unrelated group, different circumstances entirely, and handled it with a precision and a patience that 2 other officers later described in their reports without realizing they were each using almost exactly the same words. She'd been calm. She'd given space. She'd made the decision based on what was actually in front of her, rather than what she'd been told to expect. Hayes read both reports on the same morning. He sat at his desk for a long time afterward. I thought about a folder he'd kept for 20 years, moving from office to office, waiting. He thought about the morning the radio cracked open with Brooks's shaking voice and a name he'd almost stopped believing he'd hear. He thought about a wooden altar in the desert and a three-legged dog with a white ribbon, and a preacher saying finally with theatrical exasperation, and the whole desert erupting into something that sounded like a community discovering itself. He called Deacon. Diaz, he said when Deacon picked up. You're a young officer from the meeting. She's your officer, Deacon said. She handled something this week. I'm not going to get into the details. But I wanted you to know. It landed. Silence on the other end. Good, Deacon said. I thought you'd want to know. I do want to know, Deacon said. Thank you. Hayes could hear, in the background on Deacon's end, the sound of a garage, metal on metal, an engine, voices, the particular ambient sound of men doing work they understood. The ordinary texture of Deacon's life continuing. The next thing and the thing after that. How's Madison? Hayes asked. Impossible, Deacon said. And the warmth was there immediately, unavoidable, the involuntary thing that happened to his voice. Perfect. Good combination, Hayes said. Best one I know, Deacon said. They agreed to have dinner the next time Deacon was in the county. A real dinner with Elena and Madison and Red if he could be convinced to sit at a table long enough, which was not guaranteed but worth attempting. The kind of dinner that happens between people who have been through something together and have decided that the something is a beginning rather than a conclusion. The call that changed Evan Brooks's career happened on a Thursday. 7 months after the wedding, he was first on scene at a domestic dispute that had escalated in ways that the initial call hadn't indicated. He arrived to find a man in the doorway with a weapon, not pointed at anyone, held down, the grip of someone who'd reached for it without fully deciding what to do with it next. A woman behind him, children behind her. Every piece of training Evan had was firing simultaneously. Every protocol, every procedure. The calculus of threat assessment and force response, and the dozen variables that officers are taught to weigh in seconds. And underneath all of that, quieter, more fundamental, the thing that had been running beneath his professional consciousness for 7 months, was the question Deacon had asked Tommy and that Tommy had told him about over the phone one night. Who do you already want to be? Evan talked the man down. It took 19 minutes. I didn't reach for anything. He kept his hands visible. He talked, not negotiation script talking, not the procedural language of crisis management, but actual talking, human talking. The kind that acknowledges that the person in front of you is a person, is scared, is in a place where the only door they can see is a terrible one, and that your job, your actual job, beneath the badge and the training and the protocol, is to help them find another door. The man set the weapon down at minute 19. The woman got out. The children got out. Nobody fired a weapon. Nobody went to the hospital. Evan was sitting in his car afterward, writing his report, when he stopped writing and just sat for a moment, feeling the weight of 19 minutes, feeling what it had cost him to hold the right position for that long, to not reach, to not escalate, to trust the talking when every trained instinct said the situation had passed the point where talking worked. He thought about Deacon. I thought about that morning in the desert, which felt simultaneously like yesterday and like something that had happened in a different lifetime to a slightly different version of himself. He thought about what Deacon had said at the door of the department meeting, hand briefly on his shoulder. Don't waste the morning. He hadn't. He pulled out his phone. He almost called Deacon. He stopped himself, not because he didn't want to, but because he understood something sitting in that car that he hadn't fully understood before. That the call wasn't necessary. That Deacon had given him what he needed, not so Evan would report back, not so there'd be an accounting of outcomes, but because that's what Deacon did. He gave people what they needed, and then he kept going. He didn't wait to see what happened downstream. He trusted the downstream to take care of itself. Evan put his phone away. He finished his report. He drove home. The story of the desert wedding lived in the county for years. Not as a legend. Deacon would have rejected that word. Would have said that calling it a legend was a way of making it safely distant, safely unusual, safely unrepeatable. And that was exactly what it wasn't. It was a real thing that had happened to real people in the middle of an ordinary Wednesday, which meant it could happen again, which meant it was happening again. In smaller ways, in moments nobody would ever write about or remember publicly, every time someone who'd been in that desert or in that department meeting made a slightly different choice than they would have made before. Lawson called Hayes 8 months after the transfer. Hayes almost didn't answer, not out of hostility, out of the particular caution of a man who has seen people say they've changed and who has learned to wait for evidence before he recalibrates. He answered, "I wanted to tell you something," Lawson said. "Something happened here. An incident. I'm not going to go into it." His voice was different, not unrecognizably so. It still had the deliberate quality, the careful construction. But something underneath the construction had changed, like a building that's been renovated from the inside without altering the facade. "I handled it differently than I would have." Hayes said, "How differently?" "The kind of differently," Lawson said slowly, "where afterward, a 17-year-old kid shook my hand." The line was quiet. "A kid who had every reason not to," Lawson added. Hayes didn't say anything for a moment. "Richard," he said finally, "you didn't have to call me to tell me that." "I know," Lawson said. "I wanted to." Another pause. "Call Whitmore," Hayes said. Silence. "I don't know if he'd..." "Call him," Hayes said. "He'll pick up." He was right. Deacon picked up on the second ring. Lawson talked for 4 minutes. He said the same things he'd said to Hayes. The incident, the kid, the handshake, the different handling. He said them without embellishment and without self-congratulation. The plain recounting of a man who has done something and wants the right person to know about it, without needing more from the telling than the telling itself. When he finished and was quiet for a moment. "You still in that county?" Deacon asked. "Yeah," Lawson said. "Decided to stay." "Why?" "Because running wasn't the lesson," Lawson said. Deacon said nothing for a long moment. Then, "No, it wasn't." "I've got a long way to go," Lawson said. "I know that." "Yeah," Deacon said, "you do." No comfort offered. No reassurance that the distance wasn't real. Because it was real, and Lawson knew it, and the knowing of it was part of what made this call different from the first conversation in the desert. The first conversation had been a man arriving at an edge. This was a man who had taken a step past it and was looking back at the distance he still had to cross and not pretending it was less than it was. "Thank you," Lawson said, "for what you did in the desert. I know I said it before, but I need you to know I understand it differently now than I did then." "How?" Deacon said. Lawson thought about it. "Then I thought you were stronger than me," he said. "Now I understand you just decided sooner." The phone was quiet. "Good," Deacon said. "Then make the next decision the same way." He hung up. He went back to his garage, his engine, his brothers, his life. Madison was in the kitchen when he came inside that evening, and she looked at his face the way she always looked at his face, reading it accurately without asking for assistance. "Lawson," she said. "Yeah." She nodded once. She turned back to what she was doing. Then she said, "You knew this would happen. When you handed the gun back, you knew eventually he'd..." "I didn't know anything," Deacon said. She looked at him. "I hoped," he said. "That's different." He sat down at the kitchen table. Ranger came and lay across his feet, which was Ranger's way of confirming that all was well, and also that he had not been fed recently, which was a separate issue requiring attention. You can't know what people are going to do. You can only do your part and trust the rest. "And if the rest doesn't follow," she said. He looked at her. "Then you did your part," he said, "and that's still worth something." She held his gaze. She came to the table and sat across from him, and they looked at each other the way they had looked at each other across an altar in the desert, while a preacher stood patiently and a sheriff sat in the front row, and 43 brothers refused to move, with the specific quality of recognition that accumulates between people who have chosen each other through enough things to know that the choosing is not a single event, but a continuous act renewed daily, sometimes in the dark, sometimes under fire, sometimes across a kitchen table at the end of an ordinary evening. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said. Ranger thumped his tail. The road outside was quiet. The desert was somewhere south, patient and permanent, holding nothing and releasing nothing, keeping the morning the way the land keeps everything. Not as memory, but as fact. The altar was gone. The chairs were gone. The white ribbon that someone had tied around a three-legged dog's neck was gone. But the morning had happened, and the people in it had been changed by it, and the change was still moving. Through Tommy Reyes on a Tuesday night, through Diaz on a call she handled correctly, through Evan Brooks in 19 minutes that cost him something real, Through Lawson on a phone in a county 3 hours north, through Hayes reading two reports that used almost the same words, still moving outward, the way things move when they're true, not stopping at the edges of what anyone could see or measure or name. A man had walked toward a gun to protect the people he loved. A sheriff had told the truth about the man who saved him. A town had learned to look longer before it decided what it saw. And the man who'd started all of it had gone home, sat at his kitchen table, put his hand over his wife's hand, and gone to sleep that night the way he went to sleep every night, without ceremony, without accounting, without waiting to see what downstream brought, because he never needed to see downstream. He just needed